Tirumati Jayalakshmi Chittor Parameshwaran, MSc, MPhil, Environmental Science. She is an independent consultant on knowledge management, writing and change management. She did her MSc Honours Botany at Delhi University and MPhil Environmental Science at Jawaharlal Nehru Vishwavidyalaya. She is an independent consultant on knowledge management and she has served in Government Ministry of Science and Technology. She is also engaged in writing, editing, program development for bilateral and multilateral funding for NGOs. She is a member in various government high-level committees. She wrote a book towards Knowledge Society named A Handbook of Selected Initiatives in South Asia.
Welcome to UGC Countrywide Classroom Program on Environmental Science. In today's lecture, we will be talking about environmental movements in India. And in the first part of this lecture, we will be covering the following topics. We will be looking at the definition. We will go through a historical context globally of the environmental movements in order for us to understand a theoretical perspective, and we shall be looking at social science perspective and the Gandhian Marxist inspiration of environmental science in leading the movements in India, the Eastern and Western models of environmental movement. These are the topics that we will cover in this lecture. Let's first begin with understanding the definition of environmental movements. When we talk about environmental movements, we understand that it has to be a mass movement led by people, and people have to organize themselves. Often they come together with the importance of one topic or against one issue that they would like to raise. So, environmental movements essentially is a coming together of people, organizing and protesting against either a policy or a project or a program that they feel they have not been consulted and that affects their lives. So, typically in India, because most of the movements have been inspired from the time of the Britishers' presence in India, they have been using some principles of Gandhian ways of protest, and one can say that this is something that they would like to use in their protests. So, the words Andolan, the words Gherao, the words Dharna, the words Satyagraha have all been part of various Indian environmental movements. These terms refer to different stages of people's resistance to highlight and protest either against state policies or against a program or project. Thus, if we want to understand various movements, we would really like to understand some of the typically used terminology. Now, friends, you would not be familiar with these terms in the entire country because these terms are typically Hindi terms. The term Satyagraha was really coined by Mahatma Gandhi when he began his protest against salt tax. The salt Satyagraha is something that all the students would be familiar with from a history of democracy. Andolan is a term that refers to protests. Dharna is when you come organizing yourself on the street and make a march or a vigil against a certain issue, and there are placards, there are songs, there are protests, statements, and there are speeches which become part of a dharna. And in a dharna, there are also sit-ins. You might sit in outside an office of some government office if you are protesting against a particular act or a policy. You may be sitting on the outskirts of a factory if you want to protest against a certain decision of an industry and you are protesting against that. So, dharna is an act of a civic visual protest, and that is sometimes also accelerated into what is called a gherao. A gherao is a process in the environmental movement where a functionary or an important official against whom the protests have been mobilized is surrounded, and gherao means surrounding. So, an official is surrounded by the activists of a movement, and thus they would like to articulate their protest and their concerns directly to a decision making person across the table. And since a large movement cannot have a dialogue across the table, several people reach the office or gherao the officer outside his office and ensure that the officer listens to the protest issues. Thus, environmental movement in summary can be defined as an evolutionary movement where it is initiated by the process of organizing. It comes around for an issue. It realizes its goals by defining certain protest statements, posters, songs, etc., which helps to mobilize not only the people to come to the streets, to come to the forefront, highlighting the issue to the media, organizing and getting the support of other civil society organizations, and reaching to the people who make decisions. Thus, an environmental movement would consist of many players, and it is important for you to understand this definition. Now, let us go further ahead and look at the historical global context of such movements. Was environmental issue something of interest thousands of years ago, or was it only in the recent past that conservation, environmental protection, etc. became relevant? It is very interesting to note that the modern conservation movement globally manifested itself in the forests of India. Yes, it is surprising that the first time a formal need to conserve by a state was recognized by the British government, which was ruling in India. India was one of the parts of the British Empire, and conservation efforts were initiated on the principles of need to conserve for the future. So, basic scientific concepts of conserving began, and that was the first efforts by a state. And for this purpose, let us look at happened. Let me point out here the conservation ethic that began to evolve included three core principles. What are the three core principles? That the human activity damaged the environment, that there was a civic duty to maintain the environment for future generations, and that scientific and empirically based methods should be applied to ensure that this duty was carried out. Well, students, you would like to understand that these core principles were always practiced by communities, traditional communities living very close to Mother Earth, to nature, like the tribal communities, the aborigines communities globally, or the nomadic communities who used to travel from one place to another. The practices in the earlier times were friendly with the environment. As industrialization began, there was continued interest to just utilize the resources for man's needs without really taking into account that it was disturbing the ecology. And some of the scientists, botanists and explorers understood that human interventions were creating large-scale deforestation and they were leading to destruction of the environment. And they first began raising this issue at an academic level. And this academic level was brought by one botanist who was invited to involve his learning, his understanding for large-scale conservation of forests in India. And the modern conservation movement first manifested itself in the forest with the practical application of scientific conservation principles. And as this exercise of applying scientific knowledge began, it was in 1842 that Dr. Alexander Gibson, a professional botanist, was asked to make scientifically and systematically adopt conservation practice for forests. Why was this so much important for the British government? As you all know, the British government, which had set up its work in India, had primarily done so to access the natural resources of the Indian forests. Forests, whether it was for timber or for spices or for medicinal plants, were a very important resource for this process of globalization and colonization. And when these scientific principles began to be adopted, it was at a time when they felt that greater economic value could be created out of scientific management of forests. And thus, one can say with very great confidence that it was in 1842 that the first global efforts for state-led conservation efforts were initiated. Now, how does this link really to environmental movements? Begins with documentation. When people not only observe but also write about various impacts. Some people already feel certain impacts, others do not. So, scientific documentation of impact of human intervention on the society may be understood, which is done by medical research and other studies. But ecological studies means that the impacts have to be studied beyond the human beings. It has to be studied on forests, on land, on air, on water, on the animals, on the fish, on the plants. Thus, if we understand the ecological impact, which means on both biotic and abiotic resources of nature, then we know that these impacts will be affected by high level of human intervention. And this may not be sustainable. Thus, activities of human beings, if they do that without creating a balance or without sufficiently caring for the environment, will result in complete destruction, and it will destroy the future generations' access to natural resources. If we understand this concept, we would not be destroying the environment. So, this understanding was first documented by Dr. Rachel Carson. Now, can I just show you the slide in which we have described that the book Silent Spring, which was a first ever documentation of insecticides and pesticides like DDT and similar chemical agents, man-made, completely man-made and focused on agricultural production increase. Well, it was great for farmers, but it was not great for the birds. Bird populations were seen and documented for the first time by Dr. Rachel Carson as beginning to lessen in number. This led to her documentation of that book, which was called The Silent Spring. Now, as you know, when spring comes, there are lots of birds and the trees are budding. The new activities have supposed to begin with the spring season, but she noticed that the birds had disappeared and she tried to make the connection. For the first time, this documentation led. So, well friends, we would like to see what is the impact and how the global movements began after this short break. Welcome back after the break. Before the break, we talked about Rachel Carson's book and her work, seminal work on identifying the impact of DDT and other chemicals use in declining bird population. An ecological, economic analysis was made. A similar kind of intervention was done in 1972 by a set of scientists and political leaders, which was formed as a group, and the think tank was called the Club of Rome. And the Club of Rome prepared and presented its first report, which was a global eye-opener report called the Limits to Growth. What was this? It was the very first global documentation of the impact of rampant economic use of natural resources without the focus of conservation, what it would do and why the resources are limited and we need to conserve. Human economic activities, if they were not led by parallel conservation efforts, would lead to destruction. So, this was the key message that the Limits to Growth propounded. These two books were seminal publications that led to a big global movement on need for conservation, need to address the ecological issues, the environmental issues. One can say therefore that these movements are not very old. It is quite in the very contemporary age. In the last 40 to 50 years, there has been a very big global understanding of environmental movements. So, one can understand from the global perspective itself that what began as the earliest conservation efforts in 1842, about 150-160 years ago, had to wait for several years to be re-emphasized globally. And two seminal documentation works led to a rapid pace of global movement. And I would like to point out that Earth Day was on 1970, that the founder Wisconsin Senator Gaylord Nelson inspired that this day should be celebrated on 22nd April as the Earth Day. And this was to focus on the need for environmental awareness. It is not enough for academics and scientists and think tanks to talk about environment. This need to have global understanding and a public understanding through environmental education, it is the one focus that triggered public movements. When people began to understand that things happening quite far away can also impact our lives, they began to organize and protest. And this was the awareness program that the Earth Day created, was to do with oil spill off the coast of Santa Barbara in US in 1969. Within 1 year, they realized that there is a need to create public awareness. Only when public awareness and large-scale protest happens that the state will take cognizance of the importance of conservation. So, as you can see, whether it is in global space or in Indian space, the public awareness becomes a critical component. Public sensitization becomes an important component. And with these two components, public sensitization and public awareness, there can be the strength of organizing in order for change to happen. What should be the kind of change? The change should be involving ecological principles in economic practices. The concept of using ecology for economics is called sustainable development. The principle of sustainable development would require that any economic activity that is initiated should ensure that it does not destroy the environment. Now, another important historical context pertains to the Greenpeace movement. As you all know, today, there are concepts like ozone hole. There is a depletion of the ozone, and this is happening due to global air pollution, and global air pollution due to use of forests and coal and other natural resources which are burnt, fuel fossil fuel usage leads to a large scale carbon dioxide in the air, and that diminishes the ozone, creating an ozone hole. And against this backdrop of understanding, there was a creation of a group called the Greenpeace. The Greenpeace movement, let me show you friends, is an organization that was created in 1971 as an organization for political advocacy and legislation, because there were ineffective solutions that were being proposed. The Earth First, a group of ecocentric view of the world, believing that equality between the rights of the humans to flourish and the rights of all other species to flourish will only create a sustainable system. Now, sustainability as a concept took 10 years to evolve. When the Greenpeace movement first started talking about ozone hole depletion and the need to advocate for large-scale global agreements, and in 1980, which saw the Earth's first formation, there was this 10 years time for public mobilization. And after this public mobilization period, there was an initiation of a global formal institution, the formation of the United Nations Environment Program. It began post a conference held in Stockholm in 1972, the United Nations Conference on Human Environment, where they discussed the need for countries to dialogue with each other and to ensure that there is no destruction that is man-made and that cuts across political boundaries, and we need to conserve collectively as human beings, as a part of one nation, as ecological perspective. Thus was formed a formal institutional mechanism that enabled the movements that were happening in sporadic incidences, either through a think tank or through protest or through environmental awareness or through public mobilization. These enabled a global institution to be created called the United Nations Environment Program. According to Professor Madhav Gadgil and Dr. Ramachandra Guha, there is a social science perspective to this entire global movement, and we need to understand it, because movements are not born out of something without some effort, and because not enough documentation of the movements have happened, it is important to understand the theoretical construct to the social science aspect of these movements. After all, why and how people organize. In a typical environmental scenario, human beings are social beings and therefore live in collectives, interact through kinships and communities, but for larger interaction to happen, there is a need to have a focal theme or a focal issue. So, what professors have told, Professor Gadgil and Dr. Guha have indicated that environmental movements in India have been primarily social movements triggered by the poor and rural people against socially inequitable, dominated state interventions that they feel are unjust or against programs that are resource intensive. This shows a very important connect between people's dependence on natural resources and more so of the poorest of the poor in the communities. People who have lot of money can buy resources, but they do not realize that these resources will not last forever. And because they will not last forever, the poorest are the ones who understand this at the earliest, and they protest against those issues only when they can be organized. Alone, their voices are too feeble, and therefore, the environmental movements also have the same social fabric, the need to organize, because alone voices are very meek, very feeble. It does not fall in the ears of decision makers. So, environmental movements require a trigger. The trigger is the very early sensitive understanding by the people who are most dependent on natural resources. For example, the poor people are dependent on forests for firewood. They are dependent on forests for some food items, for fodder, for many things. They are dependent on the rivers and rain for farming as well as for their water resources. They are understanding the nature's interaction with human existence very well. And if they see those resources diminishing, they will be the ones who will want to raise their voice. This is the historical and social science perspective of environmental movements. Now, when you go a little bit in depth into the social science perspective, you will realize that the trigger of movements globally and in India are different. In India, as I have recently mentioned, the trigger is actually a very close understanding of the poor who are sustaining their lives being dependent on nature. This is different from how it happened in the West, whether it was an oil spill that triggered the Earth Day, or the understanding of use of DDT and birds disappearing, as was in the Rachel Carson's book, or political thinkers who felt legislation was needed. This is a Western trigger point for movements. For Eastern societies, the trigger was different. It was very much livelihood related. It was very much dependency on the natural resources. Thus, the connect was very quickly made by people, and large scale organizing of people could happen because large number of people were affected by environmental issues, by human interventions and by societal interventions that led to disappearing of natural resources. So, the social justice, equity and access are some of the principles of democracy that have been used by the environmental movements. The same thing that is used by democratic movements were also applied by environmental movements with 2 or 3 important principles. The principles of equity. Now, when we say equity, it means equal access to resources and rights to resources. Justice is when you have the ability to pay and another does not have an ability to pay, does not mean you will take away more from nature and somebody who is poor will not get access to nature. So, equity, justice and access are important principles that have triggered environmental movement in India. Now, very quickly, let us understand the principles of the Gandhian Marxist inspiration for environmental movements in India. Very quickly, we understand these terms. I have mentioned about these terms in the beginning of the lecture. The term Satyagraha, the term Dharna, the term Gherao are all principles that have looked at equity, justice and access and the people's right to protest if they feel justice is not done. These have been some of the inspiration for the various movements in India. Now, let us quickly do a summarizing of what these inspirations have been and look at a few examples. Let me point out that there are 2 or 3 examples that we will mention now and talk in detail in the next lecture that have been triggered by these Gandhian principles, by these Marxist principles. And I would like to mention the example of Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad's Gyan Vigyan Jatha, a movement that initially began as awareness to the public on science and scientific principles, soon evolved into principle for protests against environmental degradation. And this has led to large scale conservation measures in Kerala, which is now, as you all know, called God's own country, with the vibrant ecology being protected, whether it is the backwaters or the rainforests or the coastal diversity. The conservation efforts in Kerala have taken a very forefront role because there has been a large public support and a public movement which helped to trigger such a process. Two other examples are Chipko movement and Narmada Bachao Andolan. In this lecture, we learnt about the definition of the terms used in understanding environmental movements in India. There has been a number of words that we have learnt about and the contexts. The lesson further provided a theoretical construct of the movements in India and globally. In order to do that, we have looked at the current engagement of various institutions in conservation work. The historical context has further been analyzed through historical perspective, both from the body of what has happened in the past and what are the current inspirations for various movements that are active even today. At the end of this lecture, I would like you all to examine the following questions and try to find the answers. Provide a detailed description of the theoretical basis of environmental movements in India. Give one or two examples of Gandhian principles being used. List at least 4 key global events that are of significance in understanding environmental movements. Thank you for this attention.